Jason is a postdoctoral research associate working for Microtech Inc. under the guidance of Dave Morris from the Ministry of Natural Resources, Northern Affairs, Mines and Forests, and Nelson Tifo from the Canadian Wood Fibre Centre. He has worked on several research projects related to silviculture and soil health in Ontario and Alaskan forests, with a particular interest in how disturbances affect plant productivity and soil carbon dynamics in northern forests.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate being invited to speak at this. I'm still, I think, a fairly new face in this community, which is, I'm really impressed to see the scope and the types of backgrounds that are being represented here. It's a really interesting and unique experience, and I'm really grateful to be a part of that. I'd also like to acknowledge I'm actually speaking to you from Florida at the moment. I'm finding my way back up in 2 days' time to Sault Ste. Marie, where I'll be settling for the indeterminate future, working as part of with Microtech and other partners. And I'd like to acknowledge that these lands were originally inhabited by the Potano and Timucua people, and this is part of what is now Alachua County today. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit to you about the interplay, the dynamics between roots and soils and plants, and how that may be and has in large part been sort of underrepresented in our approach to restoring forests after harvesting. If you could go to the next slide, please. So we'll just start with talking about the fundamentals. You're likely all very familiar with what type of harvesting practices are utilized in the Boreal Forest of Ontario. One of the primary, not the only, but one of the primary methods that's used for species like white spruce or black spruce or aspen is clear cutting. There are many good reasons to utilize this. It removes large blocks of trees in a way that in some ways resembles fire disturbances. And this sort of helps with providing the light and access to resources that a lot of these trees depend on following what would normally be a fire event. And it's also economically convenient to do that. So there are benefits to that. However, there are also drawbacks to that. Firstly, we're not actually burning, so we're not restoring a lot of the material that is being removed right onto the site again. There's mechanical activity, which can cause potential damage to soils and maybe adjacent forest. There's a lack of remaining mature cover, which may persist in some cases following fire events. And there's a lack of a seed bank associated with that. A lot of these tree species have serotinous cones, and so they can disperse after fire. And so as a consequence, we need to replant these areas. And when we replant them, there are a lot of challenges to the survival of the seedlings that are regenerating in these areas. They face a lot of stress in their environment, and it's very competitive. And that's a theme that's been coming up a lot through these talks, is the importance of understanding how plants are competing. Because there's a lot of other plants who also want to grow in those spaces, and they're trying to go to the top. So if we would like to restore the forest to some extent as it was, we need to help provide, we often need to provide some assistance in some cases. So we can go to the next slide. One approach is, and has historically been, to use herbicide. And this helps to knock back some of the early plant growth that would be competing with the tree seedlings. And while it's effective and relatively inexpensive compared to, say, mechanical brush tending in very, very large areas, there are some drawbacks as well. While we can use more modern methods of precise application, there's still a lot of risk that it will become dispersed further than we intend, particularly after rains and with runoff events. What it does is it will actually kill off a lot of the vegetation early on, which means that the early regrowth that would restabilize the soils and cover it, and minimize erosion effects, is now being inhibited. And this can also lead to soil nutrient losses and increased breakdown of some of the materials in the soil. So it has potential drawbacks in terms of greater negative impacts on soils, in terms of structure and its ability to help other plants grow forward. It can persist for long periods of time and be transported to sensitive areas. And ultimately, although it's a lot less expensive than, say, mechanical tending in many ways, it's still not inexpensive. It could be hundreds to thousands per hectare, depending on how it's being applied. Can we go to the next slide, please? So while there are many potential alternatives, which is a big part of HAP here, one such emerging recognition, or something that's been known in part for a long time, but really not well developed and understood, especially at larger scales, is the relevance of mycorrhizae. And these are fungi that are naturally present in the soil that form symbiotic relationships with the roots of trees and virtually all plants, really. And they are able to more effectively help those plants grow. So they provide access to small amounts of nutrients that are otherwise very challenging for the plants to get. When they're in established forests, they can actually interconnect trees together, and they can help share resources amongst trees. And in return, the trees give them sugar, because who doesn't like sugar, right? And so this is a beneficial relationship for all the people, or rather all the organisms involved. Unfortunately, clear cutting is, because of the kind of extent of the removal, it doesn't tend to leave many trees behind. And there are ways, there are methods in which, sometimes more is left behind, but in broad strokes, we're removing large swaths of trees, we're killing off the roots, and so therefore these microbiota also die off, the fungi also die. And so as a result, we are not leaving an environment which is really conductive to reestablishment and regrowth of these trees in its ideal way. There's no mother trees to speak of. And these are trees that are well established and that can help nurse new incoming trees. It will come back, but it can take a long time for this to happen. And as a consequence, this can limit the survival of the replanted trees, and it will therefore also increase the likelihood of erosion and soil nutrient losses. Next slide, please. So if we're trying to move beyond herbicide, and I think we're all in agreement that that is what we are trying to do here, we want to continue to provide for the forestry as a part of the ecological framework, as a part of the community, as a part of the economy of these regions. We need to provide competitive advantages to regrowing forests that are encouraging a more healthy soil structure, that have fewer or detrimental elements associated with this otherwise, potentially, destructive event, and preferably ones that are not very expensive to implement. So we can go to the next slide, please. And this sort of ties in with the last slide. There are, many components in terms of those who are affected by this. People, for example, the First Nations and the SFL holders in the area were challenged by the use of these herbicides to maintain healthy, diverse, and economically productive ecosystems. Forests, wetlands, because everything eventually drains, and eventually drains either into the water table or into surface waters, which are then, of course, interacted with by wildlife, fish, etc. So the entire watershed, the entire region is potentially at risk for any kind of negative consequence associated with things like herbicide use or forestry activity. So we want to do what we can to minimize that. Next slide, please. This is a long build-up to go back to mycorrhizae. And one way in which we could do this is actually to pre-treat tree seedlings before they enter the ecosystem, so that they have the right fungi on them from the start to facilitate their early establishment. And this will give them the competitive advantage they need, because they are making these associations that they otherwise probably would have much earlier on. So instead of having a couple of years where they're building this up and fighting with other organisms that have different needs, or more, they've evolved for more rapid establishment under these circumstances. And the approach here is that our company, or the company that I'm hired under, Microtech, has a potential for, and actually has actively been inoculating seedlings for some time, for decades now, and planting them in different parts of Canada, different parts of Ontario, Canada, and as well actually internationally in South America. Next slide, please. And so we're looking to establish or follow up on trials that were originally implanted in Ontario approximately 20 to 25 years ago. Now, these were put in and evaluated. There's a large number of trials. And early data showed there was actually some substantial improvements in survival and growth rates for seedlings that had been inoculated with this mycorrhizal inoculum compared to those that didn't. 10 to 20% was typical, sometimes much higher, sometimes lower, depending on different conditions. And as, again, you were all probably well aware, and as the last presentation highlighted, there's a large amount of variability in these environments. And we can't just necessarily assume they're all going to respond the same to this. So while these early trials are very promising and have shown that they're worth further investigation, we want to continue to, we want to revisit this in order to be able to see what framework we really need in order to make this work. I should also add that one of the benefits of this is that it's actually generally far cheaper than herbicide application at roughly $45 a hectare. So let's go to the next slide, please. The consequences of this is, if this approach is effective at reducing herbicides, or rather improving survival, this may mitigate the need for much of the continued application of herbicides that we are utilizing in some of these areas. And then it has a wonderful potential side benefit of increased ecological benefits. So, you know, on the face of it, if we're growing trees more robustly and more quickly, we're putting more carbon on and into the ground. And I know this is extremely oversimplified, and this is a much bigger picture perspective. But from that perspective alone, that is a very, very important thing in this day and age when we're considering the impacts of human activities on climate change and carbon release into the atmosphere. The more our forests can robustly store carbon in different ways, it's a good overall proxy for a healthy, robust ecosystem. And one element of this is that we're not really clear on the full extent to how this may influence things below ground. And we have good reason to think that this may actually have some positive benefits to increasing carbon storage below ground as well. So that is something that we need to continue to explore. And below ground carbon means, generally speaking, more organic material soils tends to increase the overall, improve the structure, health, and biological resilience and robustness of soils. Next slide, please. So we are now following up on these original trials, and we're reassessing these original trials that took place 20, 25 years ago. And so we are now looking with a bit of a different lens. We're not focused just on will these survive and will these grow more overall, but rather what we want to seek to do is to link this to the ecosite framework that Chapman et al. Have developed here. And utilizing that, we have good reason to believe that this inoculation will have a much more important impacts on sites that are already much more stressed. And some of the earlier data show that more competitive sites and more stressed sites might respond better to it as well. But we need to follow that up into the longer term perspective. And what we're going to be doing is revisiting sites, linking these at the finest level of detail we can using LiDAR and other tools and maps of ecosites in order to try to tease out how and where these are this application is having the most benefits, so that we can target application in areas that need it the most, and so we can balance a mix of application with need and cost. Next slide, please. And I should also add that not only are we doing these retrospectives, but we're actually actively developing new trials where we're going to test. Once we've teased out those relationships by reinvestigating these previous trials, we are going to take that data and then build entirely new trials where we're going to test this in a different and robust framework that is designed not just for assessing seedling survival, but also for assessing how this relates to the bigger picture of ecosite survival. And a lot of it will also then focus on looking at below ground processes. We're really going to be focused on roots. We're going to be focused on soil carbon, nutrient exchanges, and we're hoping, we'll see how this plays out, to also look at the genomic components of the soil and how this may be actually altering the communities and how that compares to forests that aren't necessarily, have not been receiving herbicide applications. And so we can have a better idea of how using this product in place of herbicides may bring the forests into a more complex community, more diverse community. And for me, that is something, I'm a scientist who's been aware of mycorrhizae and looked at soils for most of my career so far. And I have to admit, it's something that I've not really thought about the bigger, broader sense of how these things come together. And the more I've been reading on the research that has been done and the perspectives of people who have seen this firsthand, regardless if they've had the scientific, been involved in scientific research or not, that there's this sort of mature ecosystem perspective that can provide enhanced resilience for that environment, and particularly at a soil level. And again, I want to go back to saying I'm relatively new to this program. I'm new to I've done some work in Ontario, but I come from a scientific framework, and I'm beginning to realize the extent to which this is likely inhibiting the way I'm looking at a lot of these problems. And I'm actively looking and interested in meeting and talking with many of you, all of you if possible, about how you see this approach and what you think this may, what needs you may have and how you would like to see that addressed. So at some point, I hope to meet with many of you and have discussions about this, because we want to reframe this perspective and how we are approaching this problem, the same way that all of us are under this HAP 2.0 program. Next slide. And so on that note, we have, as I mentioned, this is one of the most fun things so far about this has been the great number of people I've had the opportunity to get to meet and work with, and that includes Microtech, of course, incorporated in Timmins, who have been plugging away at this project for some time, Wakatoan, David Flood, Isabel, Elena, etc., who have been gracious to really get involved in this and have been pushing to get boots on the ground on this project right away, so that we're all very excited to get this going. Chris McDonald, Jennifer Tallman, Greenfirst and ICOM, who are helping us with site histories and locations, and of course Dave Morris with the extremely long acronym, which I can't remember off the top of my head, for Ministry of Natural and Northern Development Mines, Natural Resources, Forestry, and the Canadian Wood Fiber Center with Nelson Tifo. And we're all excited to hear what you think about this and what you would like to see represented in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. It's a very interesting project. Are there any questions for Jason? I think maybe I saw Wayne unmute.
Yep. I'm going to correct you on one issue and then suggest a few things for your trial in the future. But Jason, it was good to see your presentation, and good to hear you're coming back to the Sioux in a couple of days. So we'll get together and we'll definitely have a chance to talk. But on the front about nutrient loss and erosion with the use of herbicides, there's only really one study that I'm aware of that ever did that, and that was the Hubbard Brook on for relatively steep slopes, and they had sprayed 3 to 5 times annually, and then after the third application of herbicide in a row, at high rates they managed to get some nutrients to leach out of the site. Erosion didn't really start till about year 5, so we're not doing any of that in Ontario, so I don't really see the applicability of that in a discussion at this table. Okay. On the other hand, from all the work I've done with vegetation management and the thousands of seedlings that I've monitored over time, we do know that we have a couple resources: the light, the water, the nutrients, and this will really help with the water and the nutrient side of it. But we still need light for these seedlings to live and to grow. And we know for almost all the species, so work we've done with Bob White and Madev Sharma and others using the VMAP data, that there's a threshold of light that is required for those seedlings to survive, and then another threshold by which they need light in order to grow, and another threshold to grow vigorously. So simply putting inoculum onto a seedling will help with the water nutrient part, but it'll do little for the light, controlling the light. So that part, you may want to have experiments that look at different light gradients to see where it's effective and where it fails. Because I suspect under heavy raspberry or heavy aspen cover, it'll probably fail. Okay, but other where you're down below 30% cover, probably should work. Yeah, so it should be good. Anyways, good presentation, and we'll have lots of chance to talk when you get up here. Okay, thanks.
Sounds good. Yeah, I don't mean to, I'm not trying to ignore a great deal of the efforts that have been put in by a lot of people looking at these things in advance, and I make no claims to expertise in these areas so far. I'm still early foray into this. I'm working off some of the materials that I've been reading, and merely bring this up as potential concerns that that have been raised, and looking forward to introducing microbial or mycorrhizal inoculum not strictly as an alternative for herbicide, but rather as an entirely standalone way in which to potentially improve competitiveness and productivity on the landscape.
Yeah, you'll need to incorporate it with other techniques in order for it to be effective. Anyways, good presentation. Thanks. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Wayne. David? So you got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's two prongs to this conversation. It's the science of the mycorrhizae and what it does or doesn't do, or what it can and can't do. But there's the other commercialization part of it around forest carbon management that we're also exploring, which is its persistence. That's why we're doing the 20-year measurements and doing the carbon modeling and looking at commercializing it in a way that we look to inoculate, in this case, a pilot over 5 years, 50 million seedlings, and creating a carbon sequestration pool to sell into the markets. And it was actually through Sustainable Development Technology Canada, where they actually specifically asked the question, could this serve as a herbicide alternative? And they made a co-investment into not only the commercialization question, but the herbicide alternative question. So there's some pretty high level heady people up at the federal level, around climate change and climate action that's quite interested in understanding the applicability of this on the ground. But isn't it interesting? It still takes boots on the ground. It still takes guardians to be out in the forest engaging this. Mycorrhizae is in the spirit of what Wakatoan's name is, about kinship and interconnectedness. Isn't that what a mycorrhizae is? It's a form of that translocation of nutrients and materials and building a healthy subsoil, subforest floor community for the benefit of a broader ecosystem. So anyway, we're proud to be co-partners with Microtech in exploring all of these aspects and continuing to take advantage of HAP 2.0 and the consortium that we have around us here, and I can only see it growing stronger from here. Which
Thanks, David. I do see that Rob raised his hand, but we are starting to run out of time, and I wanted to acknowledge Lynn's question in the chat. She's asking whether there have been any operational plantings using this approach or only trials to date.
So I would offer, we call them large landscape trials, but essentially operational plantations, like hundreds of hectares. Yeah. So we're going back to do the remeasurement on those 20-year-old plots.
Okay. Gordon, are you responding to Lynn's question?
No, I was going to ask another one if that's okay.
Okay, well, I don't want to miss Rob.
Oh, is that right? Sorry.
No
All right.
worries.
Go ahead, Rob.
A quick question. Actually, it's a comment. I just like to say, Jason, I really like your guys' approach. I like the idea that you're combining long-term growth and then looking at some new possibilities and putting the whole thing within an ecological framework so that it all fits together. So bravo for you guys.
Go ahead, Gordon.
Okay, so Jason, I mean, for herbicide alternatives, I'm just wondering if you're going to test this Suzanne Simard's ideas about the mother tree, so what she calls the mother tree. I mean, I could see this in white pine shelterwoods for sure, is if the white pine seedlings can tap into, if this mycorrhizal network idea works, if it taps into the mycorrhizal network and therefore maintains the seedlings so that they are able to survive and grow, that because we do apply herbicides in white pine shelterwoods right now. If that kind of idea would work, or the late winter moose habitat areas that Elaine is studying, whether there's a mycorrhizal network extending out from these mature clumps, and whether you could test whether that network idea actually would help, and then as part of a herbicide reduction.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I don't think we've quite got there yet in terms of how we're planning out the new trials, but that is definitely something to consider. We have limited amount of white pine in the area of undertaking, so I'm not sure how developed we're going to be able to pursue that. But going forward, that might be something we might want to hone in on. And I just wanted to address what David said. David, thank you. You really phrased that extremely well in a way that I wish I had affected while I was giving my presentation. I do really like the mirroring of the concepts of nurturing communities below to nurture communities above with this project. And I think that's an important sort of perspective in this approach.